I think what we know is that when parents have a baby who is born early or who has medical complications, that they end up experiencing a loss. Whether we realize it or not, it's not the loss of a child, but whether we realize it or not, what we've lost is our expectation of what we thought things were going to be like. And that can be hard for people to understand because they may look at you and say, but you should be so happy. You should be relieved that your child is doing as well as they are. And people are uncomfortable with the idea that you might grieve what it was you expected things to be. But the thing to know about grief is that this is a perfectly normal, natural, spontaneous response to trauma. And really the grieving process, when parents go through it, it helps them acknowledge the new circumstances, adapt to them, make adjustments, and ultimately be able to formulate new dreams for what their family is going to be like. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about grief in our society. I think grieving is a very physical, very intense process, and it's a lot of strong emotions that people have a hard time seeing and encountering. And so because of this, I think we tend to want to put limits on how long we grieve. We feel in some ways that might be an imposition to other people. So I think one of the things that's important that we acknowledge with grief is that grieving is a process, and it's not this linear process that begins with the event and ends with acceptance, but it is a process by which over time we acknowledge how things have changed, we adapt to our new circumstances, and we are able to accommodate what it is that we need to in order to be good parents and to be a strong family. I think it's still understandable, though, that occasionally families will either encounter a new diagnosis or have to consider an intervention or have some sort of challenge that reminds them that their child's beginning in life is different than other children's, that will throw them back to feeling those feelings of grief. So instead of looking at that as being an obstacle or looking at that as being a failure in the grieving process, I think it's important that families see those things as natural and that they're just once again revisiting the issue, making adjustments, making accommodations, and hopefully coming out more resilient and stronger in the end. I think that there are a lot of emotions associated with grief that people are made uncomfortable by. I think for one, denial. You know, so many times we've looked at other people and said, oh, they're in denial, they're not coping well, they're never going to get through this until they acknowledge how things are. But I think we have to recognize that the upside of denial is if a family or if a person in crisis really had to confront and deal with everything that is wrong, with the worst case scenario, that I don't think there are any of us that wouldn't cave in. You know, denial gives you the chance to get the new information, to accept it as you're ready, and to find ways to deal with it. Another one is anger. You know, out of all those stages of grief, I think anger is really one of the only ones that's outwardly directed. And, you know, sometimes we see this with fathers, especially, that there's anger, and people want to have them not express that. But the truth is that anger is a tremendous motivator. When you're angry about something, you're able to harness that energy to hopefully make a change and to make circumstances much better. I think another thing that we often deal with, all parents who have had a child in the NICU carry a tremendous amount of guilt. It's either guilt that I didn't do something I was supposed to do and this has happened, or I did something that I shouldn't have and now my family and my child are paying for it. But the thing about guilt is just an acknowledgement that the things we do, that the choices we make have consequences. And it's good to know that all these negative emotions that we associate with grief, the anger, the denial, the fear, the anxiety, the guilt, that all these things can, in the end, have very positive results. I think each of us comes to wanting to provide peer support and be a peer mentor in similar ways. In my case, my son, Carrick, was born at about 28 weeks gestation, and at the time he was born, the survival rates for babies born at that time were about 10%. 90% of babies either had severe complications or passed away soon after their birth. Things have changed since then. In fact, the odds are actually reversed now. Babies who are born at the time that Carrick was born do very, very well, and 90% of them go on to thrive and to have very good quality of life in the end. But when we were going through that, when we realized soon after Carrick's birth that he was going to have complications, that he was going into organ failure, that he wasn't going to make it, we were faced with a decision that we never could have anticipated. This was supposed to be about his birth and celebrating his birth, and within a matter of 48 hours, we were making funeral arrangements. The thing that really helped me get through that was there was a nurse who was in my doctor's obstetrics practice who had been a neonatal nurse and who herself had had several pregnancies with very real complications and had lost more than one baby. And that day in the hospital when I had a C-section and was not ready for discharge yet, and my husband had left to go visit our son at the neonatal intensive care unit for probably the first and last time, this nurse came and sat at the foot of my bed and said to me, "We can talk or we don't have to talk, but I just want you to know that I'm here and that I have an idea what it is that you're going through." And that meant the world to me. As time has gone on and I've been able to grieve the loss of my son and to go on and to have 2 more boys, I've recognized how important that peer support was to me. And I decided that really this is too hard to do on your own. There's so much to learn. There's so much to know. There's so much you have to do when you have a child who's medically fragile. And none of us should have to learn how to do all of that on our own. If I can be that helping hand that makes it easier for the next family, that gets them a little further down the road with a little less struggle, then I feel that it is important that I be there because somebody else did that for me.